This is Christopher John Bjerknes. It is September 30th, 2023. I'm going to dispel a myth which has been circulating for about 100 years that claims that Albert Einstein was the first person to come up with the concept of space-time. And not only did Einstein not come up with that idea, he actually rejected it and argued against it, as I'll show you in a moment. I've proven all this in my book, Albert Einstein's Plagiarism of the Special Theory of Relativity. You can find that, together with all my other books, at my website, CJBBooks.com. You can also contribute to my efforts making videos on these and other subjects at my website, and you'll find contribution links there as well as in the description below, and you'll find a link to my website in the description below. So, as I said, Albert Einstein not only was not the first person to propose space-time. Hermann Minkowski gave a very famous lecture on his model of space-time in 1908. And Albert Einstein, together with his friend Jacob Laub, wrote a paper in response to Minkowski's lecture, claiming that they had a simpler system. And we learned later that Einstein believed that Minkowski's ideas were wrong and they were just superfluous overlearnedness, and he wanted to maintain credit for the theory of relativity, even though Einstein himself copied it from Henri Poincaré and Hendrik Antoon Lorentz, among many others. Einstein wrote in response to Minkowski's lecture on spacetime. In a recently published paper, Mr. Minkowski specified the foundational equations for the electromagnetic process in moving bodies. In light of the fact that this work is rather demanding for the reader with regard to its mathematics, we do not consider it superfluous to derive those important equations which follow in an elementary way, which, by the way, essentially corresponds to that of Minkowski. So Albert Einstein was trying to assert his priority. He took credit for the Lorentz transformation in this paper, despite the fact that he had been made aware that Lorentz derived it before him. Larmor derived it 4 years before Lorentz, and Voldemar Voigt, as Mr. Minkowski pointed out repeatedly, had it back in 1887 within a scale factor. So Einstein was kind of claiming his turf by saying that Minkowski's formulation of space-time was not needed and was too difficult for people to understand. And again, the point of this is that Albert Einstein did not create the idea of space-time, and when he became aware of Mr. Minkowski's model of space-time, he rejected it. Einstein's friend, Abraham Pais, pointed all of this out, and Pais wrote, "Soon thereafter, Minkowski published a detailed paper in which, for the first time, the Maxwell-Lorentz equations are presented in their modern tensor form. The equations of point mechanics are given a similar treatment, and the inadequacy of Newtonian gravitation theory from the relativistic point of view is discussed. Terms such as space-like vector, time-like vector, light cone, and world line stem from this paper. Thus began the enormous formal simplification of special relativity. Initially, Einstein was not impressed and regarded the transcriptions of his theory into tensor form as überflüssige Gelehrsamkeit, superfluous learnedness. However, in 1912, he adopted tensor methods, and in 1916 acknowledged his indebtedness to Minkowski for having greatly facilitated the transition from special to general relativity. In other words, Einstein rejected Minkowski's model of space-time. Minkowski's semi-technical report on these matters, the Space and Time lecture given in Cologne in 1908, began with these words: "The views of space and time which I wish to lay before you have sprung from the soil of experimental physics, and therein lies their strength. They are radical. Henceforth, space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away into mere shadows, and only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality." He ended as follows: "The validity without exception of the world postulate, the relativity postulates, I like to think is the true nucleus of an electromagnetic image of the world, which, discovered by Lorentz and further revealed by Einstein, now lies open in the full light of day." So by 1908, Hermann Minkowski was taking credit for the ideas of Henri Poincaré and had begun to plagiarize Poincaré's concept of space-time. In his earlier papers in 1907, Minkowski acknowledged Poincaré's prior work. Now, today I'm dealing primarily with the concept of space-time as a mathematical, four-dimensional concept. Much prior to that, the ancient Greeks, had a concept of monism, that time does not exist, that everything in the universe is coexistent, and that it is illusory in the human mind. It's an illusion that time exists and that things move. It is merely our consciousness which is constructed in such a manner as to perceive that illusion. But in fact, everything that is forever and is coextant. And one of the Greek philosophers I quote in my book is Ocellus Lucanus. And he talked about this Greek conception, this monistic conception. Every nature that has a progression possesses three boundaries and two intervals. The three boundaries are generation, height of being, and end of being. The intervals are progression from generation to height of being, and from height of being to the end of being. But the universe shows no indications of such boundaries and intervals, for we do not perceive it as rising into existence or becoming, nor growing better and greater, nor become less and worse. Rather, it always continues to persist in the same manner and is perpetually equal and similar to itself. Parmenides founded the Eleatic school, which completely rejected the idea of time. And the philosopher Karl Popper, who was one of the many who falsely attributed the concept of space-time to Einstein, called Einstein the modern Parmenides of physics. So if you're interested in the early philosophical conceptions, you can find these quoted in my book, or you can look into Ocellus Lucanus, Parmenides, and the other Greek Eleatic philosophers. This type of philosophy evolved all the way through to William James, who created the concept of the block universe, an unchanging block universe in which everything coexists. But there were also many people who created the mathematical formalism of space-time long before Albert Einstein. And there was in science fiction and other novels and tales going back for centuries, the concept of people traveling back and forth through time. And I give a long list of those in my book on Einstein's plagiarism of the special theory of relativity. So if you're interested in that, you can look up the references in my book. But let's get back to the mathematical formalism of the idea of space-time. And that was proposed back in 1754 in the famous Encyclopédie by D'Alembert, in the encyclopedia's article on dimension. It states, as I've already said, it is not possible to conceive of more than 3 dimensions. However, a brilliant wit with whom I am acquainted considers duration a 4th dimension, and that the product of time multiplied by solidity would, in some sense, be a product of 4 dimensions. This idea is perhaps contestable, but it appears to me to be of some merit, even if it is only that of novelty. So apparently when this article on dimension was published, they thought the concept of time as a mathematical 4th dimension was a new idea. Now, in my book, I give many more examples than I'm going to present here today. So if you want to look into that, you'll see that there were many, many more people who created this concept of 4-dimensional space with time expressly as a 4th dimension than I'm going to show here today. But this is from 1885, so 10 years before Einstein started writing on the theory of relativity by plagiarizing Poincaré's idea of space-time. 4-dimensional space. This was published in Nature on March 26th, 1885. Possibly the question, what is the 4th dimension, may admit of an indefinite number of answers. I prefer, therefore, in proposing to consider time as a 4th dimension of our existence, to speak of it as a 4th dimension rather than the 4th dimension. Since this 4th dimension cannot be introduced into space as commonly understood, we require a new kind of space for its existence, which we may call time-space. There you have it. 4th dimension of time, time-space. It doesn't matter if you call it space-time or time-space. There is then no difficulty in conceiving the analogs in this new kind of space of the things in ordinary space which are known as lines, areas, and solids. A straight line, by moving in any direction, not in its own length, generates an area. If this area moves in any direction, not in its own plane, it generates a solid. But if this solid moves in any direction, it still generates a solid and nothing more. The reason of this is that we have not supposed it to move in the 4th dimension. If the straight line moves in its own direction, it describes only a straight line. If the area moves in its own plane, it describes only an area. In each case, motion in the dimensions in which the thing exists gives us only a thing of the same dimensions. And in order to get a thing of higher dimensions, we must have motion in a new dimension. But as the idea of motion is only applicable in space of 3 dimensions, we must replace it by another which is applicable in our 4th dimension of time. Such an idea is successive existence. We must therefore conceive that there is a new 3-dimensional space for each successive instant of time, and by picturing to ourselves the aggregate formed by the successive positions in time-space of a given solid during a given time, we shall get the idea of a four-dimensional solid, which may be called a Sur solid. It will assist us to get a clearer idea if we consider a solid which is in a constant state of change, both of magnitude and position. And an example of a solid which satisfies this condition sufficiently well is afforded by the body of each of us. Let any man picture to himself the aggregate of his own bodily forms from birth to the present time, and he will have a clear idea of the sur-solid in space. Now let us consider the sur-solid formed by the movement, or rather the successive existence, of a cube in time-space. We are to conceive of the cube and the whole of the three-dimensional space in which it is situated as floating away in time-space for a given time. The cube will then have an initial and final position, and these will be the end boundaries of the sur-solid. And then he goes on and on. So we have space-time, time-space in 1895, therefore 10 years before Poincaré, and 17 years before Minkowski. In 1895, 1885, 20 years before Poincaré, and 22 years before Minkowski. So we have The Time Machine, the famous story made into a movie written by H.G. Wells and published in 1895. So again, 10 years before Poincaré and 12 years before Minkowski. Philby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveler proceeded. Any real body must have extension in four directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I will explain to you in a moment, we incline to overlook this fact. There are really four dimensions, three which we call the three planes of space, and a fourth, time. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former three dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction along the ladder from the beginning to the end of our lives. So we have in 1895 discussion of four-dimensional space-time. Really, this is what is meant by the fourth dimension, though some people who talk about the fourth dimension do not know they mean it. It is only another way of looking at time. There is no difference between time and any of the three dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it. All these are evidently, it is simply this, that space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of as having three dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to these three planes, each at right angles to the others. But some philosophical people have been asking why three dimensions particularly. Why not another direction at right angles to the other three? And have even tried to construct a four-dimensional geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. I wonder if Simon Newcomb was that S who published that article in Nature 10 years earlier. You know how on a flat surface, which has only two dimensions, we can represent a figure of a three-dimensional solid, and similarly, they think that by models of three dimensions, they could represent one of four, if they could master the perspective of the thing. See? All these are evidently sections, as it were, three-dimensional representations of his four-dimension being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Scientific people, proceeded the time traveler, after this pause required for the proper assimilation of this, know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace with my finger shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high, yesterday night it fell, then this morning it rose again and so gently upward to here. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally recognized, but certainly it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, we must conclude was along the time dimension. But, said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is really only a fourth dimension of space, why is it and why has it always been regarded as something different? And why cannot we move about in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space? And then the story goes on to demonstrate that one can move about in time. So, Poincaré in 1905 proposed this theory of space-time, which Minkowski further developed and greatly advanced, and then began to plagiarize from Poincaré. Poincaré had this in 1905, but between H.G. Wells and Poincaré and Minkowski, there was another significant development by the philosopher Dr. Melchior Palagi. I think he was born Zilberstein, and he came up with a new theory of space and time, the basic concepts of meta geometry, and he published this in 1901. So again, quite a bit before Minkowski. And what Minkowski did was he kind of combined the work of Poincaré and Palagi into one system. And again, this was published in 1901. New Theory of Space and Time, the Basic Concepts of Meta Geometry by Melchior Palagi. And it's really a very interesting read. He gets much more philosophical than Minkowski did. Minkowski made some grandiose statements, but they're really repetitions of what Palagi had already developed long before him, talking about the unity of space-time forms. And Minkowski recognized that this unity formed an absolute world, and that the theory of relativity is actually the most absolute theory imaginable, and I'll show proof of that. So Poincaré is really the father of space-time concepts in the theory of relativity. So we had the ancients who had this concept of monism, that God is the universe is one, the universe is everything, and nothing is introduced into being, nothing is taken away from being, everything exists all at once, and it is only an illusion of consciousness that things come into being, that things are preserved, and then things end. In the Greek conception, existence is not bounded in that way, except for in consciousness, which perceives itself and its world in that way. Then we moved on to numerous mathematicians who came up with the idea of time as a fourth dimension of space. And then in Poincaré, we have the Lorentz transformation forming a group where L is set equal to 1 to unity, And then we get into the idea of the revolutions of space and time, about this space-time concept that Minkowski fully developed into his theories. And at first he gave Poincaré credit, and then he started ripping off Poincaré's work. I guess he learned from Einstein that he could get away with stealing the ideas of Poincaré. But Poincaré developed a theory of special relativity and even got into the gravitation of general relativity in July of 1905, which was vastly superior to anything that Einstein ever published on special relativity. And he posted a notice of this paper in the Compte Rendu in early June, I think, of 1905. And that's what really triggered the Einsteins to rip off his theory and publish their theory in Annalen der Physik, which I think was submitted very late June and published in late September, I think, of 1905. So Poincaré had all this before Einstein. Einstein copied it from Poincaré. And Poincaré published this really magnificent paper in Rendiconti del Circolo Matematico di Palermo, volume 21. It was published in 1906, but it was submitted the 23rd of July, 1905. And it's called On the Dynamics of the Electron. And this is really the birth of the space-time theory of special relativity that became so significant through Minkowski's tensor calculus in the general theory of relativity. But even the foundation for that was laid in this paper, as Minkowski at first acknowledged and then began to plagiarize. So if we search through this paper, it is in this paper that Poincaré first introduced the term Lorentz transformation. It was not the Lorentz transformation. Lorentz didn't have the perfected form of it until 1904. Larmor had the perfected form of it in 1900, and the initial form of it, as Lorentz would later acknowledge, was published by Voldemar Voigt in 1887. But Poincaré pointed out that these form a group. In 1905, the group of Lorentz, the transformations of Lorentz form a group, and then he gives the transformations. And he sets L equal to unity in this paper. So all of this happened before Minkowski, and Minkowski learned it from Poincaré. And so we need to, L equals 1, we need to give credit to Poincaré as the father of space-time in the theory of relativity, very clearly. I mean, beyond dispute. But it's an interesting story as to how Minkowski at first was giving Poincaré credit and then began to plagiarize his work, and how Einstein refused to ever give Poincaré credit for the idea of space-time or for the whole theory of relativity, which Einstein stole from Poincaré, and Abraham Pais took note of that. In 1919, the mathematician Mittag Leffler wrote to Einstein asking him to contribute an article to the Acta Mathematica volume in honor of Poincaré. There were several articles in that volume paying homage to Poincaré. And this was a golden opportunity for Einstein to redeem himself and finally acknowledge Poincaré as the father of the theory of relativity. But Einstein in 1919 became famous for the eclipse observations, and he was a career plagiarist, and he was not about to start acknowledging that he had stolen the theory of relativity from Poincaré, or even acknowledge that he had been supposedly anticipated by Poincaré. He didn't want people associating Poincaré with the theory of relativity. 4 months later, Einstein responded, so he stalled Mittag Leffler until he thought it would be too late for a submission to be entered in. 4 months later, Einstein responded. The letter had reached him after a long delay, and it might be too late now. Mittag Leffler replied that Einstein could still send a paper if he cared to do so. So Einstein couldn't cop out to the idea that it was too late. He got caught again. 2.5 months later, Einstein replied that obligations and travel prevented him from contributing, asking that his decision should be considered as nothing but high respect for the task. So Einstein dodged the opportunity to redeem himself and refused to honor Poincaré's contributions. Pice wrote, in the early 1950s, I once asked Einstein how Poincaré's Palermo paper, this paper published in the Rendiconti, which was submitted in July 23rd, 1905. I once asked Einstein how Poincaré's Palermo paper had affected his thinking. Einstein replied that he had never read that paper. That's clearly a lie. I owned a copy, a second-hand exemplar of the Gautier-Villars reprint, and asked if he would like to borrow that. Yes, he said he would. I brought it to him. It was never returned to me. He not only stole Poincaré's work figuratively, he stole it literally from Abraham Pice. Sometime after Einstein's death, I asked Helen Dukas if she would please look for it. It had vanished. Einstein destroyed the evidence. This wasn't the only time that Einstein had the opportunity to redeem himself and acknowledge Poincaré. There was a article, these are 25-year-old memories for me, that was published, I think, in the Jahrbuch der Radioaktivität in 1907, where Einstein was tasked with giving a prolonged explanation of the development of the special theory of relativity. And in that long paper, he never once mentioned Poincaré in the context of the theory of relativity. So he was very determined to continue to steal credit for Poincaré's work throughout his entire life. And it was really, really terrible the way that he failed to acknowledge that Poincaré was the father of the theory of relativity. And he continues to this day to be given credit as the father of the idea of space-time, even though he rejected it when he initially was exposed to it. So let's have a look at the fact that Minkowski was indebted to Poincaré for the idea of space-time and for the mathematical formalisms which generate the idea of space-time as a fourth dimension. Peter Galison wrote, and take note of the fact that Minkowski viewed space-time as an absolute world. This was more absolute than classical mechanics, because in Minkowski's absolute world, nothing moves. Events are absolute, and intervals are absolute. So it is absolutely not a theory of relativity. It is a theory of the absolute world, which is what Minkowski called it. As Minkowski acknowledges many times in The Principle of Relativity, that was a paper that he wrote, his concept of space-time owes a great deal to Poincaré's work. Sur la dynamique du l'électron contains Poincaré's systematic search for the invariance of the Lorentz transformation, but of even greater significance to Minkowski was Poincaré's four-dimensional XYZ ICT space, which contains the seeds of the four-vector formalism. If, Poincaré writes, you assume these equations are regarded as the coordinates of 3 points P, P prime, P double prime in four-dimensional space, we see that the Lorentz transformation is simply a rotation of this space about a fixed origin. The only distinct invariants are therefore the 6 distances of the points P, P prime, P double prime from one another and from the origin, or alternatively, the 2 expressions given here, and the 4 expressions of the same form obtained by permuting the 3 points P, P prime, P double prime in any manner. Minkowski clearly draws on the interpretation both of the invariants as distances and of the Lorentz transformations as rotations in the XYZ ICT space. Notice that by giving the 4th coordinate the dimensions of ICT, Poincaré, in contrast to Minkowski, does not emphasize the non-Euclidean nature of the space. From these invariants, Poincaré was able to construct a covariant law of gravitation consistent with special relativity, and that was in 1905. He was far, far ahead of even what Einstein was able to accomplish by plagiarizing him. Einstein failed to understand what it was that Poincaré was expressing for Einstein's entire life. Poincaré was far ahead of Einstein. So Minkowski, in 1907, acknowledged that he was building on the work of Henri Poincaré, and he gave a lecture in Göttingen to the Mathematical Society on November 5th, 1907. And those lecture notes and the lecture itself was stored, and it was published eventually in 1915 in Annalen der Physik, the journal in which Einstein had published on the principle of relativity in 1905. And in Minkowski's 1907 lecture, he talks about the principle of relativity, which was Poincaré's principle. And he acknowledges that the general principle was developed by Einstein, Poincaré, and Planck. And he cites the paper that he's citing from Poincaré is that Ronda-Conti paper, in which Poincaré discusses four-dimensional space-time. And it was published in 1906, but it was submitted and states on the cover sheet of the paper that it was submitted July 23rd, 1905. So Minkowski was aware of Poincaré's work, and he was citing it in 1907. And we have another example of that. Die Grundgleichungen für die elektromagnetischen Vorgänge in bewegten Körpern from Hermann Minkowski, December 21st, 1907. He again cites Poincaré And the paper that he cites is the Rondeconti paper from volume 21, 1906, starting at page 129, which is this paper. The Rondeconti paper, volume 21, 1906, starting on page 129. And it's necessary to prove all this because so many people claim that Einstein and Minkowski were unaware of Poincaré's paper. So then, after this point, Minkowski began to plagiarize Poincaré's work, and in 1908, he failed to mention Poincaré at all in his most famous lecture, Space and Time, which he gave on September 21st, 1908. So I guess he learned from Einstein that he could get away with ripping off Poincaré's work. And he also didn't mention Palagi or any of the others who had talked about space and time being four-dimensional and being combined, as the Greeks argued, as Parmenides argued, as Ocellus Lucanus had argued 500 BC. So he does mention Einstein, he does mention Lorentz, but to say that they made no attack on the concept of space, they both believed that space was absolute. Einstein talked about resting space and moving systems of coordinates in the exact same language that Lorentz had used, even though many relativists try to claim that he did not. But it's important to note that Minkowski recognized that he was creating a postulate of the absolute world. And in his notes for this paper, in his original drafts, he utilized that expression, absolute world, over and over again. They don't appear in the final published work, but he was absolutely an absolutist. Since Minkowski plagiarized Poincaré's work, Arnold Sommerfeld published notes in the republication of Minkowski's paper, notes to Minkowski's paper, and in those notes, Sommerfeld recognized the fact that Minkowski was building upon the work of Henri Poincaré and his Rondeconti paper in volume 21, 1906, which was submitted on July 23rd, 1905. Whereas Minkowski's ideas on the vector of the first kind, or four-vector, were in part anticipated by Poincaré, they weren't anticipated. Minkowski copied them directly from Poincaré, though he failed to acknowledge that fact in 1908. That's more than being anticipated. That's being the source. And Minkowski drew from that source and then eventually plagiarized it. The introduction of the sixth vector is new. Minkowski's relativistic form of Newton's law for the special case of zero acceleration mentioned in the text is included in the more general form proposed by Poincaré in the local citation. And this is probably how this myth evolved, that Minkowski was unaware of Poincaré's work, because only that paper, that one paper from Minkowski was republished, and the other papers were obscure and hard for people to access. On the other hand, because Minkowski and Einstein took credit for Poincaré's work. On the other hand, in taking acceleration into consideration, it goes further than the latter, Minkowski's or Poincaré's formulation of the law of gravitation shows that it is possible in many ways to reconcile Newton's law with the theory of relativity. Minkowski and Poincaré had adapted it to the postulate of relativity in a more external manner. So Sommerfeld recognized that Minkowski's work was derivative of Poincaré's, but he said that he anticipated it instead of acknowledging the fact that he plagiarized it. Minkowski, in his speech, did acknowledge his old friend and mentor Voldemar Voigt as being the father of the so-called Lorentz transformation. It was Poincaré that called it the Lorentz transformation, but Voigt had it in the Göttinger Nachrichten in 1887, page 41. That article is reproduced in its entirety, as are all of Poincaré's papers, Minkowski's papers, Einstein's papers, Lorentz's papers, Larmore's book, etc., in my book on Einstein's plagiarism of the special theory of relativity. So he's citing Voldemar Voigt. Lorentz was eventually forced to acknowledge that Voigt had it, and he did it grudgingly and said that if only he had known, he could have plagiarized it much earlier, is essentially what Lorentz said. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. It's important to realize that Albert Einstein was not the father of the theory of relativity, that he was not the father of the concept of space-time, but he did gladly accept credit for both. He started forgetting about Minkowski soon after Minkowski died, as did the press. The press conspired with Einstein to give him credit for the theory of relativity and for the idea of space-time, which he did not deserve. Einstein was accused of plagiarism for the rest of his life. He skirted his responsibility and refused, even when given the opportunity, to give Poincaré credit for the rest of his life. And the real shame of all this is that this long history of the concept of space-time is largely forgotten, and there is so much to be learned from examining with a historical critical analysis, the way Ernst Mach did, how all these ideas came about, and to find the flaws, the logical flaws in these ideas. It's tremendously helpful to see how they have progressed through the millennia. So it's not only an injustice to Voigt, to Minkowski, to Poincaré, to Wells, to S, to whoever it was that D'Alembert was referring to, and the dozens of other people who came up with space-time theories. It's an injustice to all of us and to history and to our ability to understand what went wrong and when with physics, when physics slowly morphed into numerology, when abstraction and non-Euclidean geometry replaced the normal patterns of human consciousness and created a non-physical physics which is based in geometry and which is based in numerology. And a staunch critic of that transformation was Nikola Tesla, and he pointed out the idea that that physics was degenerating into an abstract non-Euclidean geometry and a numerology. And Tesla was able to make his tremendous discoveries because he believed in an ether and believed that physics is actually physical. So I hope to inspire physicists to start to look into this history, not only to undo the injustice done to these many scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, and physicists in the past, but also to undo the injustice done to physics itself so that we can return to an actual physical physics instead of being forever embroiled in the mathematical abstractions of Poincaré and of Minkowski, which have pulled us away from the ether and from a physical physics. If you would like to learn more about this, I highly recommend you check out my book either in hard copy form or PDF, which you can find at my website, CJBBooks.com. And I want to thank you all very much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you good people next time. Bye for now.